So, hi, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of familiar names on the list. Welcome to today's Convene Chat. We're going to talk about Nudgestock, Ogilvy, weaponized psychology, learn how to do more than to just ask nicely. So, I'm joined today by Oz Alashe, who a lot of you know, the CEO and founder of CybSafe, and Dr. Jason Nurse, Director of Science and Research at CybSafe. Thanks for joining us today, gentlemen. We already have a raised hand. Um, we haven't even gotten started yet. So maybe put your question in the chat, please. That's probably it's hard for us to keep track of the Q&A and the chat at the same time. Pick one of those. Lucas is moderating behind the scenes, so between us, somebody will answer your question if that was a legit. Oh, another raised hand. Okay. Maybe somebody's having. Do you want to come off? Lucas, can folks come off mute or no? We have a couple of raised hands. So let's see.
I'm not sure that they're able to, but if you all want to leave
It
questions in
says
the Q&A, we'll
chat is
address that.
disabled.
I think it's just
Okay, we'll make sure that gets up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we're just going to dig right in. I don't know how many people have heard of Nudgestock. I've been watching it for years. It's an in-person and virtual conference that happens in the UK in London, and they do a live stream, so I've always, unfortunately, attended just via live stream. But I was an Ogilvy client when I worked at Ford Motor Company in marketing and advertising. I'm old. I was actually an Ogilvy and Mather client way back when. So David Ogilvy is considered the father of modern advertising. He has one of my favorite quotes: when you've written your headline, you've spent 70 cents of your advertising dollar just on that focus on getting people's attention to the rest of your content. So, so Ogilvy actually has a behavioral science unit uh, of their business, and they help a lot of different organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, government, to change people's behavior, to get them to do what they want them to do. So when I learned this year that Oz was able to attend in person, I said, well, then we need to do a webinar and we need to talk about Nudgestock and all the great stuff, even though it's really the focus is really advertising. Um, there's a ton in this full day session that applies to those of us that are working in cybersecurity. So we're just going to start off with some questions. We're going to stop about halfway through and do a giveaway for a free ticket to our next Convene conference. This is a Convene chat, so we wanted to do that in the spirit of convening. Um, but let's get started. Gentlemen, do you have anything to add before we get started?
Lisa, not at all. It's great to be here with you. It was great to attend Nudgestock in person and looking forward to sharing some thoughts with everybody and maybe bringing a bit of Nudgestock to everyone's screen.
Okay, so I've given a little bit of my take on what it is. How would you describe Nudgestock for everybody here who hasn't maybe attended?
Yeah, well, I suspect there are a few people actually maybe who haven't heard of it, or maybe hadn't heard of it until the National Cybersecurity Alliance kind of introduced it to you. But maybe you went away and had a look. And Nudgestock is it's a festival. That's probably the best way I would describe it. Imagine it's a festival on stage. They've done an incredible job of bringing together lots of bright minds, lots of creatives, and then of course lots of people very specifically focused on scientific research and evidence. And they've put them all in a room. It does definitely have a very heavy advertising stroke marketing bent, but ultimately I was sat alongside people who were had nothing to do with marketing and advertising, or certainly the advertising and PR industries. They were from other industries, people from government. There were people there who were from defense. There were people obviously like myself who were there from cybersecurity. Didn't meet too many of them. There's about 500 people in the room, and really what they are doing is sharing thoughts and celebrating the ability to take an evidence-based approach to changing behavior, and doing so at scale, actually, because of course many of these organizations, certainly in the advertising space, are trying to do this at scale. So that was how I would describe it. Yeah.
Jason, anything to add, or what? How about you tell me what your favorite session was?
Yeah, I mean,
Weird.
I was covered it really nicely in terms of what the focus of Nudgestock is. I will admit that this is my first Nudgestock, and it was a virtual one for me. And it was actually amazing, and I can't believe that I never attended it before because it was interactive. Even though I was sort of watching it mainly online, and there was so much that was covered, and so many different ways in which sort of behavioral science is being used in industry. I think that's the thing that stood out for me. I would not have imagined that breadth of research of kind of exploration in companies that we all know they're sort of like household brands. So to actually your point about my favorite session, probably, I mean, it was very hard to pick. And I'll be honest, you gave us some heads up about this question coming, and still, it was really, really hard to pick which one was my favorite. But I think one that stood out to me quite a bit was the one where I think it was Jordan Buck. He was talking about taking Odeon from Mission Impossible to A Beautiful Mind. I think why that one stood out for me quite a bit, it was very much around sort of understanding behavioral science principles and how these principles can be applied to the consumer behavior. And probably if I just focus even on one quote that was, I think, really probably for me, because my background is very much for those of you that don't know, my background is very much in academia. I am a sort of a career academic that sort of now transitioned into industry and trying to bring sort of novel insights from research to sort of the industry space. And one of the quotes that stood out for me there that Jordan mentioned was, "Why listen to your customer isn't always right."
Hmm.
And for me, that
I
was
took
when I
that
read it, I
same
thought,
note.
yeah, when
Yep.
I read it, I was like, wait a minute, this is okay. I can see where you're going with this, but it was really interesting to watch that play out. Where in that sort of that experiment, that test, that research, they basically asked customers about what would make them more or less likely to pre-order food, and a lot of customers said, well,
When they're
yes, we
buying a
a
theater
movie
ticket, a
ticket,
cinema ticket. Yeah.
exactly, when a movie ticket. Thank you. And many people said, well, if the prices are lower, definitely I'll pre-order. If the discount is high enough, they'll pre-order. But when it came to actual decision, people didn't act. So even when they were given what they asked for, they didn't act. And what was sort of discovered was that it was actually sort of not only the message, not only sort of giving people what they want, but also the timing. And it was found that yes, that makes sense. If you prompt people 1 hour before the movie instead of whenever they're buying their movie or theater ticket, prompting them 1 hour before reminds them, oh yeah, I didn't get the food that I thought I would get. Yeah, definitely want to pre-order now. So I think for me, watching that play out and watching these sort of real life experiments, and for that was a big, I see big UK cinema brand. Watching that play out was really, really informative, and that really showed how active behavioral science is being applied in industry. And I won't go into detail, but my second one, if for those of you that haven't watched it, definitely suggest watching it, is the one on Sprite, the Coca-Cola company. That was really, really interesting. I won't spoil it for anyone
Sound
because
makes food taste different. Yeah.
exactly, like that. And I love, and I'm not sure if any lawyers are listening in, but I love the constant also focus on we wanted to do X, but the lawyer said no. We wanted to do X, but the lawyer said no. But playing that out in a real life, real world scenario where they tested some really interesting research with people, getting people in. So for me, yeah, exciting stuff.
It was
The
interesting that
Jordan,
one. It was interesting
the,
that one because they literally gave everybody chili sweets. They gave us a bag of sweet, which set our mouths on fire, and then gave us this Sprite can afterwards to demonstrate. And it was also just interesting watching the kind of the trust in the room because they said we've done this and this is what watching a number of people, including myself, put this stupid thing in our mouth and set up. But they really have thought through kind of how indeed they think through this kind of behavior change angle of it in an interesting way.
the Jordan Buck session that you mentioned about the cinema chain, Jason, is that the reason that they think that people weren't ordering food, they were giving people what they wanted, giving this discount if you pre-order your food at the time that you purchased your movie ticket online. Um, the reason they think that people weren't doing that wasn't the behavior that that was being exhibited was because at that point when you're planning to go to the cinema a week or two in advance, you are thinking, oh, I'm a rational person. I'm going to have a salad before I go, and I'm not going to have the junk food that's at the theater. So they realized that that was their explanation for why they think if you prompted people, if you texted people an hour beforehand, then they would actually order because at that point you're like, oh man, that popcorn's going to taste really good, and you didn't eat the salad or whatever. And so it's this, I think there was some of the ration that we always believe that we're more rational than we really are. And that was kind of
Exactly.
how they were gaming people there. He talked about how they used they tested four different nudges. So, a lot of consumer facing companies do a lot of testing on this stuff. Um, about their loyalty program. So one was identity, just being a member and earning points. Affect, so that post cinema feeling, like going for the emotions. Exclusivity. So the framing there was that you were getting benefits only for members if you join the loyalty program. And then endowment, that psychological ownership, saying that the points are already yours, you just have to create an account to claim them. And when they found the one that worked best, their click-throughs went up 100%, and the number of people joining their loyalty program went up by 3x. And so I'm not going to spoil the session and tell you which one of those techniques was which nudge worked. You're going to have to watch the session. And I think I can find, there's a few people here asking for the link. Did we put it in there? Yeah, it's all on YouTube. So all the sessions are on there. I actually have a hint for people if you're looking at all those sessions, because it was a day's worth in London, and thinking, I don't have time for this. Play them at 1.25 speed. You can still understand what everybody's saying, and it just kind of cuts down on the ums and ahs and some of the dead time, and you can still comprehend all of it
Lisa,
if your brain can follow that fast.
I was just about to say, I don't know whether to be slightly offended at the idea that you were surprised that you could still understand us on 1.25 speed. The language isn't quite that different, but I'm glad. Do you know what was interesting about that session? And indeed, they did it a few times actually. This was one of the things they did very well, which was talked about the particular technique that they used, and then the underlying basis, the underlying evidence base. They did something which we think is extremely important. We don't do enough of in security. Often we will all say to ourselves, right, we're going to send a nudge or we're going to remind people of something, send a notification, but we don't test what is the most effective intervention. And so we really missed the most juice. They laid out very clearly, and when you guys watch that session, you'll see they talk about which ones of those different techniques was most effective. But they wouldn't have known that if they hadn't tested.
Right.
And then of course they were able to scale the one that does. And I just think that that was my key takeaway here, which was that's absolutely the right way to do this, which is it's not enough to just say we're going to send a nudge or we're going to do this intervention. You've got to test, ideally pilot before you scale, because otherwise you might scale something that is a third of the effectiveness of the other options. You
It
might
could
scale the
be, I
wrong.
mean, these are companies that are selling to the general public, to the consumer. So it could be in some of our organizations, if you've done personas, what works if somebody's just, Nathan, thank you. What if different nudges work for better on different people? So what works for like your development community, if you're trying to get them interested in secure coding, or if you're trying to generate interest and demand for your services from the development community, that might look really different than trying to generate demand from like HR on secure hiring practices, especially these days with everything North Korea is up to. Um, so different things might work on different personas. So you could test in different personas depending on what it is you're trying to achieve.
And therefore you've got to control what you're testing. So if you think about it, we're going to send a nudge to our general population in order to get them to, I don't know, visit dodgy browsers less frequently. Um, if you don't send the same thing to everybody, and then of course quite importantly, if you don't have a control group where you don't send anything to anybody, then you will never really know whether it's a difference between populations or whether it was a difference between your nudges, or indeed whether it was something else that happened. We had this in an organization recently where the CEO happened to make an announcement about cybersecurity that day, and so if they didn't have a control group where they didn't do anything, they wouldn't have known whether it was the nudge that was effective or whether it was the fact that the CEO made the announcement that day. Those things happen in an organization. And so if you're going to go to all that trouble to do the work, make sure you test and control.
What other sessions stood out, or what do you think were the best takeaways for the whole day? I think you just gave us one, Oz. What else would be like I mean, for me, I think one of the things, personally, my favorite session, we were chatting before we started the webinar, and Oz guessed it. I said, "What do you think my favorite session was?" And he knows me well enough to know it was a woman named Moz Farrelly, I think is her last name. She was a Hollywood producer. She produced what, The Apprentice or Celebrity Apprentice. She produced, I mean, so she told this one story that was really, really good, where she needed to have some of the people that were going to be in the show. I think it was, I forget what show it was, because didn't she do like Big Brother or something
She did
else?
Big Brother. Yeah, she did a whole
She
bunch of
needed
yeah.
conflict. Like she needed, and the person that they were going to have on the show was somebody that was a nice guy, and like nothing fazed him. And she needed in order to have some drama, she needed this person to not be a nice guy. Because I think it was like a reality show like Big Brother where you're not casting or scripting anything. So what they did was, in order to put this individual in the right frame of mind to be effective on camera, um, they sent a driver to pick him up as they would normally do for this celebrity individual. And they sent the driver an hour or two early and then had the driver knock on the door and say, "Can I use your bathroom?" And the guy was like, "No, go away." And then he comes back an hour later, an hour earlier than he was supposed to be picked up, and says, "Man, I really need to use your toilet. Can I use your bathroom?" He says, "No, go away." So then they said, and the driver was actually an actor who was interacting with the celebrity. So then he comes back an hour after the time he was supposed to be picked up. I think he was supposed to be picked up at 9. They sent him back at 10. And then the guy's fuming by that time, like, "You're late. Where have you been?" "Well, I had to go find a bathroom," right? So they finally get him to the studio. And then they ask him if he wants coffee or tea. He says coffee. They bring him tea. They're doing, thing after thing after thing to just cheese this guy off so that by the time he gets in the room for on the set for the show, he's in a dour mood. And so it's just brilliant. I mean, the psychology that she's able to use to get what she wants. What I liked about her talk for people in security is her focus on how unless you get people's attention, you can't deliver the rest of your message, and that we really have to focus on just how much noise is out there. Yeah, Tom, it does sound like manipulation. How much noise is out there, and but I mean, honestly, Tom, that's what we're going for, right? I mean, she hammered home again and again and again how to make people do what you want them to do. And that is the business that we're in. And I think, I don't necessarily, to somebody's comment here, I don't necessarily think of it as evil, right? I think of it as psychology. Brands, like Oz said a few minutes ago, you had the session on Sprite, you had another session that talked about packaging with Coca-Cola. Like big brands do this to us all day, every day. And the fact that we don't take advantage of some of these techniques for, I would argue, goals that are much have a much higher calling than selling you something. We're trying to keep you safe and we're trying to keep our organization safe. So I think sometimes we get a little wrapped around the axle about using some of these techniques because it does feel like manipulation. We're watching social engineers manipulate people, and that's icky to us, right? Like we don't want to go there. But the reality is, like, if we don't use psychology and behavioral science to influence people to do the things we want them to do, then I don't think we're really doing our jobs completely.
I
What
think
do you guys think?
I mean, I think one reality I would sort of hone in very very quickly is the fact that just like you said, Lisa, cyber criminals are. So I do a talk called hopefully there's no psychologists on the call, but if you are, I apologize in advance. I do a talk titled "All Psychologists Are Cyber Criminals." Really, the talk should be all cyber criminal psychologists. But the ethos of the talk, and the thesis behind the talk, is that cyber criminals are increasingly leveraging psychology for their attacks, for their scams, for their social engineering, and all parts of their attack are really crafted on a very, very clear understanding of how we think, how we believe, or our thoughts, our impressions. The fact that, for example, when we go to a website, very, very quickly, we don't scan it for detail. Is this the right website? We very, very quickly, using representation as bias or sort of cognitive heuristic, we just look, okay, does it look like the website we expect? Yes, it does. Let me put in my details. Cybercriminals know this, which is why they copy websites, exactly, copy the branding, which is why they call us up at key points in time. They interject into key decision-making processes. So metacognition and all this stuff is mentioned in the chat. They understand how the human brain works, and increasingly so. And to be honest, I mean, at one point, one of us was going to mention generative AI, so I'll jump on that grenade first. They're using generative AI to actually even better understand how to target individuals, how to craft social engineering attacks. And I do believe really, really strongly that we also, on the sort of defender side, we need to better understand how people think, how people approach security, and then leverage that to better support them in the context of engaging with security. And it sort of, it was once a good thing to do, but very much now it is a must. If we sort of leave people alone to sort of, they'll be completely vulnerable to cyber criminals in terms of how they're acting, what they're doing. So it's really, as much as possible, trying to leverage, I would say psychology, I would say behavioral science, anyone that actually is super interested in really delving into this. I think health psychology and sort of behavioral science from a health perspective has so much to teach us in cybersecurity. You know, one of the things that, for example, Oz and I, and which at CybSafe we often talk about is, for example, our watches. And, you know, I'm sat here, I'll probably be sat here for at least the next 20, 40 minutes. At some point, my watch is going to buzz me saying, hey, Jason, you've been sat too long, you need to stand up. And these are sort of just-in-time nudges. They're trying to nudge and support healthy or better security behavior. And I really think when it comes to cybersecurity, we need to leverage that as well, because it's not a sort of a set it and forget it, give someone some training or give someone some insights once a year. Cybercriminals will change, they will adapt. The first well-known deep fake scam back in January 2024, that came out, and the guidance back then was if someone calls you up and pretends to be the CEO or someone requesting money, of course, tell them go away because they're not legit. But no one had said, but then if they say, okay, let's jump on a video call so I can show you that it's me, and let me prove that it's me via video call. No one expected that that was real and that was going to happen. And that was real, that was happened. And an employee paid out $20 million to someone that they thought was they were basically following the CEO's recommendations. So I think we always need to be cognizant of that and help people on that journey when it comes to engaging with security.
So
I love,
there's
I love the fact
really
that
healthy
there's
conversation going on in the chat too. Go ahead,
well,
Austin.
I was just going to say, I love the fact that there's a really healthy conversation going on about the ethics of
Yeah.
what some might determine or call manipulation, what some people would say is social engineering, what others would say is the application of psychology and other social sciences. And the reality is, this is a healthy conversation to be had because it forces us to kind of get close to ultimately what we're here for, which is how do we do a good thing and see a positive outcome and have a positive impact without crossing lines that are inappropriate and of course are maybe on the wrong side of the ethical boundary. And what is really great about the debate is actually, I'm not entirely sure. Well, we all have a view on what is a right or wrong answer, but the truth of the matter is that we know that there are also kind of blurred edges. Really good things can be used to do bad things. And it's actually really rather possible to take something that many people use to do a bad thing and apply it to deliver a really positive outcome as well, and without doing a bad thing in itself. So I just think it's a really healthy thing. And I love the fact it's going on in the chat.
Yeah.
Poor Lola there is getting beasted by everybody from what I can see.
Uh, Change gears just a tiny bit. There were a couple of speakers early in the day that talked about kind of the role of creativity or creative thinking and like how that's treated in organizations. Sarah Tucker talked about polymath. So it was honestly a word I hadn't heard before, but she talked about cross-disciplinary thinkers. And I think we are the quintessential cross-disciplinary thinkers of the security team, right? Where most of us are not 100% technical. Some of us might not even be like 100% marketing or communications people. We're somewhere in the middle. And she talked about how, really complex problems demand people who can hold opposing thoughts in their minds at the same time. One of the things she said that I thought was really, really interesting was join teams that don't need you,
Mm.
right? Like I can think of a million security teams that I've interacted with where they don't think they need somebody who's soft skilled until you actually are a part of that team and you realize like all the benefits you can bring because you're good at communicating, you're good at influencing, you're good at understanding human behavior and psychology. What did you guys think of that session? I think she might have been the opening keynote.
She was, and indeed, not only was that a great talk, but it was such a great point as well. If you think about it, one of the things that we, as a community of people who are focused on primarily the human aspect of cybersecurity is such a broad subject area, but the human aspect is kind of one of those base elements of security that just undercuts and touches everything. And so, in this kind of increasingly digitized space, where ultimately there's pros and cons from the practitioners that we spend time with, we see pros and cons. One of the cons is that virtually every single person thinks they can do your job. Every single person has a very strong view about what should happen in order to get people to pay attention to security, to
Have
change
felt
their
that way our entire
change their
lives.
behavior.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a reality. And of course, in part, that was also because, and often still stems from this view that ultimately what we need to do is to communicate with people and educate them. If we communicate with people well and we educate people well, we'll get the outcomes that we need. That's not how behavior change works. And so, actually, this is a technical space, or indeed, this is a technical space, just not of the digital technical side. There's a lot of
Scientific.
technical understanding that needs to be applied to do what we need to do. And the more we connect with people who are outside our space, the better we'll be at doing this. Because, as Sarah said, the reality is that forces us to think about things in a way that's different and see how people are solving other similar problems in other spaces. And we've heard it here. People are giving examples in the chat. Jason gave an example. This idea of getting people to do something else that they would otherwise do based on a set of contexts is not unique to security. So, in that sense, it's such a great way to do it.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the reality about when it comes to creativity, especially in security, I'm very, very happy to see that I'm seeing much, much more of it. And it really sort of, I don't want to use the word revolutionize, but it really opens much more people to security than before. Because, for many, many people, security is still the Department of No, right? It's started the group of people that don't allow anything, they don't want anything to happen. But I think increasingly now, creativity is sort of making its way more into security. I've seen some really interesting people approach security, approach training, approach just engagement with people, just to break down the barriers of thinking that security is this super technical thing that doesn't involve others. Even from the case of so in addition to my role at CybSafe, I am also an academic. And one of the beautiful things that I've seen there now is much more transition where we don't have purely technical people coming into security anymore. We don't have this sort of just traditionally computer scientists, history students, we have psychology students, we have people that have trained in chemistry, all these kind of students coming through. And I think they bring a richness to security that we wouldn't have had before. And I think it really, for me, it emphasizes the cybersecurity part of it. Very much speaking, and from years ago, decades ago, it was very much sort of a data security, information security, very, very technical. No, it's much better, and I think it's better it will generally help everybody because we can be much more clear about security being much more inclusive and then any approaches towards better security being much more engaging and appropriate for people. One thing I just want to mention as well as it relates to actually just this topic is it reminds me a little bit of the old behavior report. And the old behavior report, hopefully everyone on the call knows the old behavior report. If you don't, shame on you. Definitely a report you should check out. Will be launched sometime in early October or late September. Anyway, OBehave, Annual Security Attitudes and Behaviors Report. One thing we seem to find every year is that people are frustrated when it comes to security and staying safe online, and then people are intimidated about security. And I genuinely believe that creativity can help solve that. If we can be much more creative about how we're thinking about security, it can help break that barrier, which I think will make everyone much better off.
Yeah, so I think the reason one of the reasons why we asked those questions specifically is because when I was new in this role and I reached out to you guys about doing something, it was because I'm a marketer who didn't have any consumer sentiment about cybersecurity. And if we're going to be, as our little nonprofit, we kind of think of ourselves as the security awareness people for the country, then I got to know how people are feeling about this. And we have had some assumptions, but we didn't have any data. So the reason why that's really good to understand is because instead of the answer isn't just being contrary. The answer isn't to say, "Oh, don't be frustrated." The answer is to say, like, or the answers to these problems. the creative thinking starts when you say, okay, I know people are frustrated. How am I going to leverage that? Like I have to acknowledge that, but there's a way I can use it. And that's where the behavioral science comes in and the psychology. Or I know people are intimidated by this. So instead of just saying like, don't be intimidated, this is easy. Here's how. I mean, sometimes there's a place for that messaging, but acknowledging it and figuring out how to leverage it instead for influence, I think is more effective. Um, yeah, so I still love that we do that report every year. I think there's really good stuff in there.
Excellent.
We appreciate all the collaboration and everything with your team. You guys do amazing work. Um, there was a speaker named Roger Martin who I think is a business professor, and he said some things that I think really resonate. I'm
Mm.
just going to share my screen because I have a screenshot here of one of his slides. He said some things that I think really resonated with me as somebody who has spent a lifetime doing annual strategy and annual planning. and and there's so much psychology in what we do that when you go through this business process of like what's your plan and what budget do you need and what's your strategy, and that sometimes it can feel like our stuff is squishier than maybe what you might be hearing from the SOC or something on what their annual planning looks like or other areas of the business. So his session was, I think it was titled "Why Hierarchies Hate Innovation." And I mean, I think innovation is critical to what we do and creativity. So we talked about how strategy is actually a very creative thing compared to planning. Um, there's things we control, like the budget and the specific tactics. Like I'm going to run a simulated phishing program. I'm going to do annual compliance training, right? These are just tactics of things that we're actually under I control, things that we control. But there's one super important thing that we don't control, um, and that's dependent variables like in the case of the presentation, customers, or in our case, our users.
Mm.
We don't control them. And yet our job is to improve their behaviors, to influence them to improve their behaviors. So making sense of that and how you create a strategy and a plan. Your strategy is really, and I'm quoting him, a series of choices to compel customers or users, humans, to do what you want them to do. Um, and seeing this, like I think a lot of us get mixed up between what is really a strategy and what is really planning. So I like the what's on the screen now. This strategy or planning is a set of initiatives that are under our control, and strategy is really putting before people an integrated series of choices that compel them to do a certain action. Um, so most people, when they do strategy, is actually really planning. It's not so much that other piece, the more creative piece about influencing people, influencing what's not under your control. You can only plan the things that are under your control. I can't plan for people to do things when I don't control them. Um, anyway, I thought that was a really interesting talk. Did you guys have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I love this talk because I think this issue of, and I would say this, I guess, a former army officer. But strategy versus planning is quite key to the difference between kind of executing well and but potentially not necessarily executing on the right thing. You can execute it really well, but not necessarily be executing on the right thing. And then the work that needs to happen up front that gives you the best possible chance to ensure that what you're going to execute against is really going to deliver the outcome. And I think that's really cool. And I think that the reason I think it's again true, some people I think they're doing strategy, but what they're really doing is planning, both of which are important, by the way, is actually strategy is creative. You touched on that there, really exciting. It's literally about making choices, which means that there are some things you could do, but you are choosing not to do. And that process by which you decide what that is really rather powerful. Um, it's also important because actually, if you think about it in the context of being a human risk practitioner or security awareness practitioner, or focus on security culture, however you think about it in your organization and wherever you are in your stage of maturity, there's probably other things that you want to achieve beyond just getting people to behave differently. If you're being brutally honest, there are probably some other things that are really important to you. So let me give you some examples. You might say that actually getting increased leadership support for the program is really important over the next 12 months. So I want to influence and impact the users in my organization, but I also would like leaders to really see the value in what we're doing. You might say that actually, as well as doing that and getting users, I want to actually get the security team to take greater responsibility. Outside of my little bit of the security team, I want other aspects of security to understand, for example, that they also have a role to play, and this data that I'm being held from is actually a shared resource for us to achieve a whole bunch of outcomes. Those are all things that if you know that that's what you want to do, from a strategy perspective, you can build into the work and activity you do, and then you can plan accordingly. Maybe you're starting to change some of the metrics that you're reporting on. Maybe you're reporting in a different cadence set. Maybe you're attributing and giving credit in places that maybe a bit obvious, but you're overly emphasizing them in order to ensure people feel bought in. There's all sorts of reasons, and it's not just about what users do. So this is why I think this is such an exciting aspect. Are you thinking and indeed engaged in the activity of strategy, or actually are you planning? Both are important, but be clear about which one you're doing.
I think that's great points, and I think for me, it was the thing that stood out for this talk the most was actually it. I think everyone now talks about data quite a bit, and data is sort of, it's key, and we all generate so much data, and data provides so many unique insights. And this talk, even though it was sort of making distinction about strategy, the key thing that stood out for me was the focus on saying, hey, yes, data is important, but creativity is also important, and we can't forget that. And it sort of links to the previous talk we were just discussing. And I loved in this talk where at some point in time he suggests people actively challenging leadership that just says, hey, but the data says that we should do X. And everyone's saying we should listen to the data because the data says we should do X. When someone has a really creative idea, and I think in during his presentation he puts forward, I think, an interesting scenario, an interesting case of Nokia. If I'm not mixing up the 12 talks,
No, you're right. It was really
it
good.
was sort of really interesting situation of Nokia. And for those of you that haven't watched it yet, sorry, it's a little bit of a spoiler, but it's relevant to what we're currently discussing. In that the gist of it is that Nokia had ideas for smartphone. And it was like, well, hey, we're quite early on. We have some ideas for a smartphone. Should we launch this? What should we go with it? And because of the data, because of what traditional smartphones looked like, it was like, no, 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 no. These Nokia phones that we currently have, they're really good. They're selling. We just keep with status quo. We just keep with this. And essentially, they shelved the smartphone idea for about 5 years. And then, of course, at that point in time, Apple comes out, leapfrogs everyone, takes over
Yep.
the market, still has a strong, a grip on the market. And no offense to Nokia, but where are the Nokia phones now, right? And I think
Right.
this is really, really key because it's just, I mean, and many other smartphone providers might have fallen into the same trap because sometimes we're led too much by the data. And we need to think, even in security, and to just bring it back to security, yes, we need to think about the data, but we also need to think about the creativity. We need to think about the innovation. We even need to think about not only even technical data, but the human data and understanding people and thinking very clearly about the audiences that we're dealing with and what's going to engage them better, what's going to provide or support them better in what they need to do. I'm a really, really strong believer that security should work for people, that security should fit people, as opposed to people should change their days for security. And people should, and I think that's really important. And that I think will drive lots of different designs of how we think about security going forward, actually. But that I think that talk was a really interesting one. I won't lie, when I started to watch it, I thought, oh, I'm not sure I'm gonna like this. But then when I got to the end, I was like, oh yeah, I can see this. I can see what's really important, especially of course thinking about strategy.
He made the really simple point that when you really stick to making data-driven decisions and having data guide your whatever it is you're working on, that all you're looking at is the past. There's no vision there, right? You're not forward thinking, you're not being innovative, you're not, to your Nokia example that he used, like data is just a window into the past.
Yeah,
It
and
doesn't
of course,
necessarily help you predict the future.
Exactly, and of course, the key variable here, especially in the context of this discussion, even in marketing or in security, is the human element, right? Like
Mhm.
the unpredictability there, and not only that, even the unpredictability at an individual level, at an organizational level, at a national, at a cultural level. There's so many differences in the nuances of people. In marketing, probably leaps and bounds ahead security and understanding that. But in security, really need to understand that more. It's really going back to the old saying, it's really not one size fits all. People are very, very different. Personalized approaches, that's where we should be thinking of focusing.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick, I won't even call it a break, just an intermission here. and give away a free ticket to our next Convene conference. It's coming up in Cleveland in August. I think it's the 26th and 27th, if I'm not mistaken. And Lucas, would you tell us who is getting a free ticket to Convene? I'm really excited about the speakers. We've got the Deputy Director of CISA, the new Deputy Director who is currently the acting director until we can get Sean Planky confirmed. But he hasn't been out speaking a lot yet, so really excited about that. And then also the CISO for the state of Ohio, the CISO from the Cleveland Clinic, um, folks like Paul Raphael, who's if you've heard, if that name sounds familiar, he's been on Hulu. He was on a Hulu special lately on romance scams called Hello, Beautiful Anatomy of a Romance Scam. He also knows a whole lot about sextortion and has become an expert on that. Anyway, Lucas, who's our winner today? I'm going to sound like a game show host.
All right, our winner for the free convene tickets today is Mike Pearson. We will reach out to you. We should have your email, so we'll get in touch with you and get you all the information we need to get you registered.
And Lucas, do you have for everybody else, do you have a discount code that you can throw in the chat?
Yes, I will throw one in the chat for you all.
Okay, and then the link to the website.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I hope to see some of you there. We've got a really good speaker lineup. I'm really happy about it. And if you've got budget issues these days with travel, going to Cleveland is not expensive. The hotel is insanely reasonable. So and for a lot of people, it's that we've seen signing up. It's driving distance. If you've got flight restrictions or whatever, it's not hard to get there from the East Coast or any place else in the Midwest. Anyway, okay. How about what did you guys think of Professor Charles Spence? I have to go back and remind myself what I'm visual, so oh yeah, I remember him. Okay, I have to look at his picture on the YouTube video and then I'll remember what his talk was about. He talked about multi-sensory experiences. So a little bit back to that, you know, how noise can make food taste differently. Like any ideas there on how we can apply these principles about our senses to cybersecurity?
Struggling to get myself off mute because yeah, no, I think this was a really interesting one. And I did actually, this was one of the ones I thought on the way in, I thought, well, how's this going to be applicable to us in the security space? But I took a few notes here actually that I ended up kind of thinking, okay, maybe this might make sense. You know, one of the things that he talks about, this kind of idea of multi-sensory experiences, was and the examples they used for those who haven't yet had a chance to watch it, they gave examples of the color of certain foods and red food dye influence in wine perception, and actually quite literally if the wine, the liquid, is colored a different color, it fundamentally changes the taste of this. And of course there are examples of this happening with smell and various other things as well. So I guess the thing I took away with it is just this idea of trust and association. There's something about in there for me, trust and association, that just means that we automatically anticipate, or we automatically assume that something will be so and something will be the case. And I know of a lot of teams that have already kind of clocked onto this in the idea that they would build a kind of a brand that people would buy into, a tone of voice that people would buy into, a set of imagery that people would buy into. And when they see this, they would know, or they would know to expect. So I just thought that was interesting. That was one of the things I took away. Also, the use of alerts, the idea that you would kind of grab people's attention in a way that's not jarring, but ultimately, and we see this again in devices that we use every day. Indeed, even with security messaging, actually, that's being used. Somebody has logged in from to your device from another place. Don't worry if that's not you. Then do this to take care of it. And so, just there were just a few things here that I just thought were maybe parallels with security. Yeah, off the top of my head. Well, not off the top because I actually made a couple of notes beforehand, but I made lots of notes during the session.
I think for me, I won't be honest, I struggled. But you know what first came to mind? What first came to mind is a term that we probably haven't heard for a long period of time, and that's metaverse. And it came to mind especially because of the immersive experience that it allows or that it's supposed to allow. And then I started to pivot and I started to think about, various different technologies that we're seeing, like the Vision Pro from Apple, and the fact that, if some of these technologies, if the world plays out how some of these technologies are in, or how these technology companies are envisioning, us going to work in 2 years, in 3 years, might be us actually going in, yes, our home offices, but putting on a virtual or mixed reality goggles or something like that and interacting in that way. Now, I think if society does progress in that way, then I think there's much more opportunities for these more kind of mixed sensory approaches to security. Where, for example, there is additional prompts or additional nudges or even different feelings. But I think overall, that was one of the presentations. I won't lie that I did thinking that's super interesting. I didn't recognize that we are so influenced by so many different parts of different products that are around us. When it comes to security, I think for me it was a little bit difficult. Probably the thing that stood out most for me in that presentation was, I'm not sure if any of you remember this, but the Booba and Kiki effect. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
That stood out for me, and it's a pity. I really should have had those two ink blots on screen and get everyone in the audience to vote. But the general gist of it goes, there are two sort of ink blots, two sort of shapes, images on a screen, and essentially they ask a bunch of people. Um, if you had to take one of these words, either Booba or Kiki, and you had to assign it to one of these particular shapes, which one would it be? And it was really interesting to see that across different peoples, cultures, everything, more people chose a certain word for a certain image, for a certain visual. And to me, that was mind blowing because it was like, well, there's clearly some underlying, psychology, there's some underlying thought, some norm, something going on here that's making us think when generally the gist of it is the booba was assigned to more a rounded object, whereas the kiki was assigned to more sharp objects. And it was really interesting watching that talk because the way he explained it, it played out where I think it was Cadbury that actually followed through on some of his research, and Cadbury sort of changed
Yep. The
instead of
shape of the
having
candy,
exactly,
the
instead of
shape of the
having sort
chocolate.
of exactly the I don't know, square chocolates, they changed it to circular, and thinking, hey, actually based on the research this is going to have a big difference, but they didn't make one main change which led to a bunch of other stuff. But the point being that there's so much more there that we can understand, and I think the question still is very much in the air: how do we apply this knowledge, how do we apply these underlying norms to security?
Yeah, somebody brought up color theory in the chat. That's I think Perry Carpenter and I did a talk at SANS a couple of years ago where we talked about color theory. That's really, really important too. I hope we've all moved on from using red and black in everything in cyber to scare people.
Actually, on that point, one thing I would mention that stands out really briefly that I think actually related to one of the other things that we might or might not discuss is more and more cues that I'm seeing around. So for a little while, probably for the last couple of years now, when people get an email from someone outside of the organization, more and more organizations are putting a sort of a little note at the top. This is from outside your organization, so be a bit more careful or be a bit more cautious. What I'd be really interested in is actually looking at how each organization implements that. Some organizations use red color to implement that. Some use blue, some don't use any color at all. And for me, that's actually one little bit of an example of how, once again, these colors are being used to prompt people in different ways. And the same, the adage, red danger, be careful, etc. Whereas I find it really interesting because, of course, in, for example, Asian countries, red is actually a really good color. It's positive, it's prosperity. Whereas in the West, red is danger, stop, don't go. So I think there's so much different things that we can unpack here. It's incredible.
Yep, yep, there's really a lot there. Um, So we've talked a lot, we've danced around this question, but I'm just going to read it as is because I think you guys might have more to add here. Subtle cues, creative approaches, and friction can alter decision making. How can these cues and nudges be used in the cybersecurity setting beyond simply telling people what not to click? So I know we've kind of touched on this, but maybe let's go back up to 10,000 feet and see if we can talk about it more generally, more uh, strategically.
I think again the beauty of the question, but also the underlying principle is it kind of drives us back to what is the easiest way the most effective way to achieve the thing that we're trying to achieve. And just linking back to that point that we just made earlier on, talking about boo-boos and kikis, which again, sorry for how weird that sounds to anybody who's listening. It will make more sense when you watch the talk. Um, that really the thing that also reminds us is to not fight against certain kind of inbuilt views and beliefs that people have already. There's some that we have to change, but ultimately, if you're trying to fight and change everything, you're going to make life much harder for yourself. So, are there any that you can use to help you achieve the ultimate thing that you're trying to do? And so, in the case, I think to an organization that we've worked with recently that's just had some quite good effect at changing a bunch of security behaviors that have reduced risk for the organization. But the thing that was interesting about it is because, again, if you think about it, when it comes to behavior change, it's an equilibrium between driving forces and restraining forces. So we talk about friction all the time, often, but we forget that, and we talk about basically trying to overcome friction. We forget that one of the ways you can overcome that friction is to remove the friction in the first place. What is it that's stopping people from doing the thing that we want to do? So you can apply friction to use it in a good way to help you, but you can also remove friction in order to stop, remove the blockers. And this particular organization, one of the things they wanted to get people to do was to use the right Wi-Fi network. Believe it or not, they are an organization who had a bunch of Wi-Fi networks that people could connect to, and they found that some people were connecting to the wrong Wi-Fi networks, either insecure Wi-Fi networks because it was just quick. Well, they didn't know why, or indeed in some cases they threw up a kind of malicious Wi-Fi network to test, and they had and too many people joined that for their liking. And they then explored why. They asked the question, what was the reasoning? And this is the key point here. We make so many assumptions as security professionals about why people do what they do. And sometimes we just need to go and get the answer and make it easy for people to tell us. And then obviously assess that against everything else we know. And they found that by reordering the Wi Fi networks, they significantly reduced the number of people who connected to the wrong network. They could have done
Brilliant.
all sorts of training. They could have put all sorts of posters up. They could have spent a huge amount of time doing all sorts of things. It was understanding that ultimately, if they could remove the friction in this particular case, how far down people needed to scroll to get to the right Wi-Fi network, that would make a difference. So that's maybe one of the ways I would apply it.
I love that example.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things I would mention, and that's a really good one because I mean, what that's really all about is sort of defaulting to a secure decision, right? And that's sort of one of the key things there to emphasize. And I think that we can definitely leverage that more in security. Another one, I mean, I just mentioned the sort of email banner design, sort of using tone and color psychology to actually remind people towards if you see a message that comes in, if you see something towards the top, very quickly, it's a color that maybe you pick up on and you recognize, oh yeah, this is external. Maybe I should be a bit more cautious. Probably another one I would mention. Is and I think this one is quite important. So often, and even coming back to the overhead report once again, because there's so much insights there that I like to pick up on is we look at sort of reporting behavior, reporting phishing, why people report, why people don't report, why people report security incidents and not. And I think one of the interesting things there is often people don't report because they think nothing happened. They think, okay, well, you're telling me to report phishing, you're telling me to report security incidents, but when I report it, nothing happens. I just press report. It goes into a black box. I never find out what has happened. Has it been helpful? Has it not been helpful? Has it had any impact whatsoever? And I think the key thing there, the sort of creative approach, the thing that we should lean into more as security professionals, is closing that feedback loop. If someone reports something, going back to them and saying, "Hey, thanks for that. That has had an impact. Here's the impact it's had. Here's what that's meant." By reporting this phishing incident or this phishing email, it has meant that we have been able to take that email from everyone else's inboxes across the organization, which might be thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. I think it's really, really important that much more in security, we sort of often, we see it almost operate a little bit in the shadows. And I think the key thing is to close these feedback loops, make people aware and help people understand that the support they're providing, the input they're providing is making a difference. It is being useful. I think that can actually be extremely helpful. Even if someone reports something, feeding back to them and say, hey, great job, you helped prevent X people from being compromised or affected in some way. I think that's really, really powerful because it closes the feedback loop and it helps people to understand that what they're doing is beneficial and also that it's helping others, it's helping their colleagues, it's helping their friends. I think that's another thing that we should be tapping into more in security.
Yeah, you're kind of covering it a little bit, but I see a few people mentioning this in the chat as well. we tend to focus so much on the negative and the things we don't want you to
Yeah.
do. What do we do more to reward the positive behaviors and um, what kind of other nudges can you use or techniques when it comes to rewarding people for doing the right thing? I mean, closing that feedback loop, just acknowledging what they've done with positive messaging is really good. Um, any other thoughts?
In terms of things that you can do to reward
Reward
people.
people for doing the right thing. Yeah, focus on the positive instead of the negative.
Yeah, so if I can think of some of the examples, I know that some things have been called out here. So I think I've seen at least one person say that we've seen people give some sort of tangible reward,
Yep.
a voucher of some description. Remember, praise is a reward, especially if that praise is public. So actually calling people out in front of others, we see that. And of course, that also now doubles up on two things. It doesn't only touch and hit that intrinsic reward for that individual, but it also gives you a token from a social proof perspective as well. Other
Mhm.
people in your organization are doing things. Look at Charlie over here. She's just done this, and indeed, maybe you could be like Charlie more. So those are examples of how some examples of kind of how we see people being rewarded. The most common one, and indeed one that goes the furthest that we see, is literally just letting people know that in itself is a reward. We see you, we appreciate you, and you are part of what you've done. That was worthwhile, which just simply not just encourages people to do it again, but ultimately means that you just kind of embrace other people in that activity that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Cybersecurity Employee of the
Be
Month.
nice. Yeah. Be nice.
Yeah, it'd be nice. I mean, yeah, I mean,
Niceness is in short supply these days. All right, we're almost out of time. Any parting thoughts, guys?
I've always got parting thoughts, and so indeed, I'm concerned about that, and we only have a few seconds left. But maybe what I would say is, one of the things I loved about Nudgestock is, it's the kind of they would describe it. It's like I said, I used the word phrase festival. It's a creative misfits, scientists, and like I said, hard hitting, and indeed very focused business people trying to work out how they achieve what they would consider to be very, very important. I love the mishmash. And I think in security, that's the thing that excites me the most about the human aspect of cybersecurity. And maybe my passing thought is this: we need to lean into the mismatch more. That's one of the things that we'll commit to doing, continuing to do at CybSafe and Impact and Convene and the O Behave report. These are just examples of just bringing together lots of different minds and then taking away what we need to do and applying it to what we do. And I love that. All of the people on this call, I suspect, are that way inclined anyway. Otherwise, what are you doing sat here for the last hour listening to three lunatics talk about a bunch of scientists and creatives? But we need to do more of it as a security community. I love it.
yeah, yeah.
Jason?
I think for me, it's sort of more about the amount of ways in which behavioral science can be applied to interesting problems. We saw it a lot at Nudgestock, but there's so many more opportunities that can be applied to security. And one of the talks that we didn't get a chance to talk about, one of these sessions we didn't get a chance to talk about, I remember there was I think it was about the UN food program. And I think that was
Oh
really, really
yeah.
interesting. So if you get a chance, please check it out. And it was really all about, 900,000 baguettes per day were being wasted. And they came up with an extremely creative way to stop that waste, to reduce that waste. And I think that's what we need to do in security as well. There are a lot of people out there being scammed, being phished, being tricked, being exposed. We need to think more about creative ways in which we apply behavioral science to solving the issues that people are facing in security. I think that's the key thing. And that involves everyone, right? Everyone on the call now has a part to play on that. So I think that's my sort of takeaway.
It's a really good thing to end on. Thanks, everybody. We're out of time, but thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you at Convene or on our next Convene chat. Thanks, Oz and Jason. We really appreciate it. Have a good
Pleasure.
day.
Take care,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye.